She said no.
That seemed fairly clear-cut to me, although it didn't to that jury. Has admitted to some of this behaviour that is terrible, and I thought, oh, he's back playing cricket.
The worst thing about it all was the bad publicity.
And that really fucked me off. And this guy comes up to us and goes, "Do you want to touch my dick?"
If you're in a club and someone smacks someone's bottom.
It's not reported because people were just like, oh, that's just like the normal.
We don't really tend to classify that harm in the same way.
It does have these causes that are quite identifiable.
There is a culture underlying that allows that to be okay.
It's really about power.
So they say 1 in 3 women, 1 in about 5 to 6 men.
Well, they say 1 in 3 girls before they're 16.
70% of the sexual violence perpetrated on young people is other young people.
It's just really, really common.
We're in one of the most violent countries in the developed world.
Most often the perpetrator is someone the person knows.
90% of the time when women and girls need to defend themselves, it's against men that they know.
Like the myth of real rape as this super violent thing done by a stranger in a dark alley that leaves a person bruised and bloodied, and that's not consistent with reality.
We know that sexual violence is a problem across communities.
It permeates, every level of society.
I can absolutely hand on heart say it doesn't matter who you are, where you are. This could happen to any one of us.
It's that first year away from home for many students, living often in halls of residence. There's a huge party culture, there's a huge binge drinking culture in New Zealand that we have to factor into all of this. There's the sexual experimentation, there's the hookup culture. So we're actually sort of loading all these things together. And when they come together, unfortunately, there seems to be quite an explosion of sexual assault.
One of the overall findings of my research is that perpetrators will sexually assault more than 1 in 3 students during their time at university. 2/3 of the people in my study reported that the perpetrator was a fellow student.
When you mentioned that 1 in 3 statistic, everybody knows it's there, but nobody realises it's as big of an issue as it really is.
It's pretty shocking. It's a third of everyone. It's thousands of people. So
I think it's not acceptable, but at the same time, in some ways, not entirely surprised, I guess.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit shocked.
I reckon it comes mostly hand in hand with the sort of drinking issues we have as a culture.
I think the drinking culture, not only Dunedin but in New Zealand, probably doesn't help.
They just, have alcohol and they can't control themselves, and one thing leads to another.
It probably is mostly men doing nasty things, just physical power imbalances, I guess.
I don't like saying it, but definitely I feel like you see a lot of guys getting a bit mad, and I think ego has a lot of thing to do, and everybody go a little bit crazy around.
For most of the guys, especially if you're in a group, you might feel left out, so you're just trying to fit into the group.
There's sort of a dangerous group culture amongst some of the teams that I've been part of.
I think it also comes down to more so who the person is themselves and their own sort of values.
People like to chalk up the alcohol rape thing to oh, it was because of the alcohol. But we know that alcohol doesn't cause these behaviors. People do.
Alcohol works in 2 ways. One's to excuse the actions of the perpetrator, and 2, to blame the victim.
You can have 100 women passed out drunk all over Dunedin, and nothing bad is going to happen to any of those women unless there's a person around that's interested in raping them.
Rape myths were largely formulated by defence lawyers, right, historically, who use these as a way to get their clients off. Right? And so over time, these have started to permeate society, and they've become part of our everyday.
She asked for it, or women lie about being raped, women exaggerate about being raped, he didn't mean to do it, rape is a trivial event, rape is a deviant event.
There seems to be through the Western world quite an agreement, you know, that you're at fault, it's your fault because you asked for it, because you wore that skirt. You can take almost any behaviour that someone does and say that meant she wanted it. You know, she walked down the hallway with me, she kissed me, she didn't fight me off, means she wanted it. She said no, well that was play because she wanted it.
That plays out across all cultures. So within a Pākehā dominant culture, you blame yourself if you were drinking, you blame yourself in terms of the clothes you were wearing, or if you were out late at night, or all the other things that other people blame you for, you internalise. And that would play out within other cultures. Why were you alone in a room with that person? Why did you allow yourself to be in a situation?
Very few survivors come to us who were sober, who didn't know the person, who reported straight away and knew exactly what happened to them was wrong. It's not the nature of what our services see. Everyone seems to walk in with some element of self-blame for what happened.
Self-blame can work as a coping mechanism. So people then, if they internalise what happened to them as being their fault, that means that they think that they can avoid a similar situation happening in the future. So it gives a sense of control. So if I didn't do X, Y won't happen again.
We still live in a world that is profoundly shaped by social inequality, and that leads to marginalizations that increase people's risk of different kinds of misfortune and social harm, including sexual violence. And so when you deny that that exists and you point to the individual to explain things like victimization, then you are effectively blaming individual people for what has essentially been caused by their location within a social landscape that is not of their making.
People are not comfortable about the rapist that is their brother, or the rapist that is in their workplace, or, you know, or the rape culture that is just there all the time.
We won't change our country's horrific and drastic record on sexual violence until we reckon with how we as a community have valorised power, how we've divorced it from respect for one another and respect for different experiences, and acknowledge the fact that that power has for a very long time been restricted to a very small group of people, and that power has been abused.
Intersectionality kind of ties back to some of the initial feminist movements where women in the United States started to stand up and say, it's not okay, I'm being treated as property. And that was a really important conversation. But then women of colour started to stand up and say, actually, you're not including me in these conversations because my experience as a woman of colour is quite different to your experience as a white woman.
These patriarchal issues that we talk about also cannot be separated from the context of colonisation and the inequalities that have arisen as a result of capitalist developments.
You know, women experiencing sexual violence, and lots of the people who have perpetrated violence against them have been men. That's like a this is the part of gendered violence. That's not something that is being challenged when you say there are people who have experienced sexual violence who are men, or that there are people who experience sexual violence that are part of the gender diverse community. Lesbians and bisexual women experience disproportionate rates compared to women who are heterosexual. The most recent research around the experiences of trans and non-binary people in the country, it's 1 out of 2 trans people have experienced sexual violence.
We know that people who are disabled experience specific and unique forms of sexual violence, experience it more frequently than other members of the community, and also have more barriers to accessing appropriate support following that.
It's really unfortunate because obviously Māori women are overrepresented in these violence statistics. And because we live in an incredibly racist society as well, there's been this growing sort of belief or understanding that violence must be cultural, which it isn't at all.
There's no culture that condones violence, right? And there isn't any culture or religion that condones sexual abuse.
The impacts of colonisation on Māori people in general and being incredibly traumatic and incredibly violent has allowed for poverty, intergenerational trauma, and therefore violence to fester.
That's why we talk a lot about
colonisation, that's intergenerational impact, because we're all born into violation. So, our tupuna were born into it, the great-grandparents, and my mother was born into it. So when she had us, she was still living in it, giving birth to us, pregnant during that. So we get that impact of that as it's a spiritual impact.
Some of those other groups, disabled, elderly, other gender descriptions, for those groups, those populations to be heard, when you don't fit into male, female, good, bad, right, wrong, it's very difficult.
Sexual violence is harmful for everybody. It's uniquely challenging for men in a different way, in the way that it's uniquely challenging for women, in the way that it's uniquely challenging for people in the rainbow community and who are gender diverse.
This whole attitude of tough up a lip or drink some concrete, harden up, like that's something I grew up with.
His response to me saying that I was upset about something he did was that I sound like a chick.
And my dad would kind of call me gentle in a kind of derogatory way.
That probably informed, I think, the male view of women as well.
Particularly, I feel in male groups, the way sex is talked about is like, oh yeah, like a game nearly?
And I think for a lot of these guys, they're not bad people, but it's just like they're constantly surrounded by this environment that makes it seem okay.
We know that that's how we should behave, but how we've actually been taught to act is different to that.
The reality is that we've grown up in a country that was colonised not so long ago, and we've had this tough, uncompromising view of what men should be like. I mean, my dad was a lovely guy, but he didn't give me a lot of cuddles. He didn't hug me and tell me he loved me. And we've had generations grow up like that.
I mean, basically we bring them up to look at anything that is considered female as wrong, as embarrassing, as we don't go there, we don't do that. Our national sport is rugby, which is very masculinist and violent. We don't give any space for young men growing up for being different. And when you think of the heroes and the iconic men in our history that we get told to revere, it's Ed, Hillary, knocking off, the bastard Everest. It's, which is the All Black, the one who got a groin injury and played on to the end in great pain.
Was it one of the more physical test matches you've played in? It certainly seemed that way.
It's the measure more of the man than just the player that caused the words "bring back Buck" to echo around the country.
That's what we think is the male at the top of the apex, the big, strong, tough guy.
I would say that they're stoic and hardworking, and that they sort of reserve their emotional tenderness and communications primarily and exclusively for their romantic relationships.
Brought up to think that the only feelings that are acceptable for a male to express are feelings like happiness or laughter or anger, but feelings of fear or shame or confusion or vulnerability, they weren't seen as acceptable.
I finally tell you how I'm feeling for a change, and all you can say is, "Oh, for fuck's sake, Kev!" The way that masculine kind of culture is enacted by some people in this country, which is quite a sense, or can be, a strong sense of entitlement and power over. An expression I hate is "boys will be boys."
Boys will be boys.
That's just boys being boys.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
Is the whole "boys will be boys" thing is still, alive and well? You would think not after all this time, but yes, still alive and well. Boys will be boys. I don't think that's an excuse. It's like, I've got 3 sons and I've never once said, "Oh well, they're boys." To me, it's like, no, you're responsible for your behaviour.
That is such a core part, I think, of why we have tolerated this behaviour for a really long time, because it is totally tied up in many people's sense of who they are and their identity, what it means to be a man.
What feminism has done is that it's broadened the script for at least some girls growing up to actually have greater options and to have a greater say about the kind of image that they want to present, whether they want to be, into dresses or dungarees. But I think for boys, we still keep them within very narrow confines of what's acceptable.
Men are meant to be aggressive or more assertive, they're more confident, they're more in control of situations.
I'm going to continue to do things the way I think they should be done.
So those kinds of attitudes, which really fundamentally are about valuing males over females, they still exist in our society at every level, and they still play out in sexual violence.
I think we actually teach boys to believe in their own sexual entitlement to women, and to actually see sex as less about connection and more about conquest.
So you got something up your sleeve for tonight, Finch? This is a foolproof plan, my friend.
One of my sons once said to me, yes, but girls play games. And my response to that was, then don't play it with them. So, it's like, so that was a belief that he had from his friends that, girls would say no, but they don't mean it. And it's like, no.
Men are more inclined to hear a yes, where in fact there may well be a no. And so there's assumptions. One of the assumptions is the rape myth that women will say no when really they mean yes.
They started to slowly wear me down.
Like a river carves a canyon.
Now let's both play.
She's playing hard to get. She's not wanting to appear like she's a slut. So they can tell themselves, she's just making it a bit difficult. I'm going to have to work on her.
A lot of it looks like feminist work is done. Women have the same rights. We can be heads of the military if we want to be, right? There's no formal barriers. The barriers, those have been chipped away at over the last 150 years by feminists fighting really hard. Those laws were not handed to us, right? They were fought for. But cultures take a longer time to change than laws.
You hit 12 or 13, because there's some really young people going into high school. The moment you're there, you're like fair game, basically.
And then you do start getting this attention, and it kind of makes you feel gross.
Then you do hear about women being attacked, and then you're like, okay, the fear is real, and you kind of always have to carry this fear with you.
Even I, right now, would feel uncomfortable walking by myself at night time.
You feel like a walking target because you are told to be careful.
As a 19-year-old, if a 50-year-old man says something to you and he's like your dentist to tell him to go fuck himself, you're probably not going to do that.
Just having to deal with fucking idiots all the time.
That's half the reason we have this problem, is at the same time as we're pumping up men, we're crushing women down, and they are taking that on.
I remember when I was an intermediate being called a frigid slut. And I was like, oh.
What can I do so that doesn't happen? And it's kind of like nothing.
Females are socialised to not offend people, and particularly to not offend men. And a part of that is about, being a good female, not challenging male dominance. But another part of it is that actually it can be frightening to challenge a male.
As a preteen, walking down the street with all of my mates, a guy will drive past in their car and whistle out to us. It becomes very real, that sense that, women are sexual objects.
In terms of our society, we do need to be looking really closely at what's been called rape culture. And our acceptance of sometimes comments, actions that may seem quite minor, but that actually create a sense of ownership of women's bodies.
Silencing and objectification are two mechanisms that really support and maintain rape culture and keep patriarchy embedded in our social context.
Man talk.
I see patriarchy as an historical system that's come down through the centuries that has kept reinforcing a message that women are lesser than men, and that's kept reinforcing a message that men have the right to be dominant over women, because they are more important, but they're also more rational and more sensible, and they know how to protect, and they're stronger, and that there are all these rationalisations that have been made that through the centuries have been used to make sure that men have been the ones who actually have had power.
What a puffed up, self-involved pile of political bollocks.
We have lots of fun and games there.
We just all internalise the norms of the society that we live in. And that's one in which, unfortunately, women are still seen as lesser. And young girls, I think, from a young age as well, are taught to be quite competitive with each other.
If you say, oh, that's her, she's a slut, she deserves it, I'm not like that, in some ways you can be, rewarded for that.
Generally, it does come from your friends, just from a space of like, oh, you should feel good about this, somebody's interested in you, like, you must be wanted.
I was kind of, always covering up and kind of looking at those girls thinking they wanted that attention, who weren't doing that, who had short skirts. And I was like, oh, I'm part of the problem.
And I don't think that's something that's inherent. Like, girls aren't mean. It's just that that's learned behaviour.
That would make me a slut. Slut shaming that goes to the girls. And that's bandied around such a lot. Even if somebody hasn't done anything.
It's not so much about how much sex they're having. It's about the amount of agency they're perceived of having over their sex. For, say, like able-bodied, attractive white women, being perceived as an agentic slut or whatever is going to be a heck of a lot easier because you're not having to work against all these cultural stereotypes about you as being loose or whatever else that, that women of color or women of other sexualities and disabilities might be facing.
Did that woman get fucked last night?
It seems as if she did.
Oh, hell yeah.
Look as sexy as you possibly can, yet you'll be blamed for inviting rape if anything goes wrong. So damned if you do, damned if you don't. Woman's life.
Get a piece of ass anytime I want. Shit, I got Carol in the bedroom right now, passed out cold. Could violate her 10 different ways if I wanted to.
What are you waiting for?
Patriarchal
Will you go out with me?
What? No!
No?
No!
No.
Hey, pal, she just told you.
Why not?
I don't know, because I don't want to.
All right, well, you know what you're saying.
Oh my God!
Even if they get rebuffed, even if they get told no, then actually they've got a second, third, fourth chance to just keep on trying and wear that person down in a way, and that's seen as part of the romantic equation.
It would be this kind of trope of being like, no, 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 but actually I want it. In reality, it could be like, no, 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 and I still don't want it. But then you actually just end up feeling kind of more and more compelled because you're being kind of pestered and pestered and pestered.
Even if we haven't been taught consent is yada, 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 we still, there's still a lot of social cues that I think we still learn.
Consent was originally a legal term, and so we're trying to take this legal term and we're trying to apply it to a social context. And I think that does have some issues because what's legally consent is potentially quite different to how we think of it in our everyday interactions.
Some of the problems with our consent law is that it doesn't give a positive definition of what consent is. So it has a whole lot of things about what might not be consent. For example, you don't need to have said no or fought somebody off to have not given consent. For example, you've not given consent if you're asleep or unconscious.
Consent's an interesting one because at the moment, the way it's sort of positioned, it's about, really putting the onus on the woman to actually demonstrate all the ways in which she said no or resisted or fought back. If we looked at it from the other perspective, we'd say, well, For the guy involved, what were the factors that he took into account when he made the assessment that she was consenting?
That's where we need to be heading to, is being clear enough about consent that it needs to be freely given, so there's no coercion attached to it, and that that it's an active thing. You know, you can't assume consent because somebody didn't say no.
When this narrative is specific to particular configurations of relationships, queer people themselves internalise a lot of that. It's not possible that I'm going to perpetrate violence or can harass anybody, because that's a really specific narrative that this isn't part of, so I'm not able to like perpetuate any of those narratives.
Places like Grindr is completely a safe haven for a lot of racism, where people out of preferences can say, oh, I don't want an Asian person, I don't want an Indian person, I don't want this, or I don't want that. But if I do hook up with you, these are the things that will happen and you can't say no. That in itself means that people can be put into dangerous positions because they have no power to fight back or to say, I don't want to do that.
If it's not an enthusiastic yes, it's not consensual. But I think a lot of people, or a lot of young people in particular, don't understand the whole sort of nuances or grey areas around consent.
Because people aren't saying, no, I don't want to do this, that can be used as an excuse, and is used an excuse by people who want to take advantage of other people.
If someone said to me, hey, do you want to come to the movies tonight? I'm not going to yell no in their face. I'm going to say, I've actually got a little bit of work tonight. They know what I mean, I know what I mean. And it's the same way, the research shows this too, that people refuse sex the same way that they refuse anything else.
Let's say it's your best friend's boyfriend or something like that who's trying to come onto you and you're not into it. You've got a whole lot of calculations to do in your head around not only what am I capable of doing to stop this person, but what are the consequences of that action to all my relationships, and how am I going to manage this, right? And it's a lot to process.
There's a lot of competing goals that you have going on in that moment, right? So one of those is your safety goals. You want to be safe and be out of that situation. But the other one is you might have friendship goals.
I remember years ago reading a study that Liz Kelly in England did with women, and you know, these women talked a lot about how they felt a real pressure to engage in sex. Some of them would agree to sex and would be compliant because they felt that the consequences of not going through with it were worse than the consequences of going through with it.
If someone says no, well, they don't even have to use that word. It's about having a degree of social intelligence and being able to read a person. And I think also people pretend not to be able to do that in order to get away with things.
Nicola Gavi, who's a professor at Auckland University, has done a lot of interesting research working with young men around sort of conversations about sexual assault. And what a lot of her research has found is that young men in particular understand consent. They understand that, you know, sexual assault is wrong. But because we live in a society which feeds into those sort of patriarchal dynamics and offers very little accountability, they feel like they can just sort of get away with it.
To suggest that people don't know about consent is kind of missing the point. So the point is people know what consent is, they know what consent looks like, but perpetrators ignore because it's not in their interests.
A man used to walking red carpets, now in handcuffs.
More than 70 women have come forward.
Please just write Me Too.
Some of India's most powerful men have resigned.
Thousands of women are using two words on social media.
Me Too.
Me Too. Me Too.
We can challenge our perpetrators.
The perpetrators are free. They're roaming the streets.
Continue a national conversation around sexual violence.
The machinery set up in every country. But there are a lot of men who complain that actually dating is now impossible.
But I've had a lot of false charges made against me. Really false charges.
Hang on.
Women are coming out and telling
sexual
stories.
misconduct accusations.
Stay quiet and be nice.
Held accountable.
Working on Me Too has been some of the most exhausting yet the most rewarding work that I've ever done.
You know, a lot of people contacted her to talk about their stories who wouldn't have contacted an agency like us, so it gave a whole other route for, what was hidden to become transparent.
People have more of an awareness, and things that they previously might have thought were, I didn't really enjoy that interaction, but it might have been okay. There's that realisation that actually what happened wasn't okay.
The biggest thing that I saw from the Me Too movement was the amount of males, that's stepped up. We're going to actually change our attitude.
It is no longer okay to brush it under the table, to hide it. But there are a lot of people in positions of power all over the world that haven't quite got that memo yet.
There were people who called it a witch hunt and who seemed to think that we would just be publishing kind of unfounded allegations all over the place, when actually that would be impossible. It has to be so rigorous. Sometimes it feels easier not to say anything, because if I don't write anything, then I don't get any abuse and I don't get any rape threats. Maybe it would be easier to just not say anything, but that's never an option for me.
And yeah, there was a backlash in some parts around, they're just, what was one, penis-hating, hairy-legged, feminist, and I think that was just a lot of males got scared.
These grown-ass men talking about how they're like scared to shake their female employee's hand, and I'm like, no, don't like sexually assault them. Like maybe don't say weird stuff. Like you do know the difference between like a handshake and like grabbing their ass, right?
Like a lot of the people who I have spoken to and written stories about have actually tried other avenues of justice. It either hasn't been taken seriously, or it's been mishandled, or it's been so traumatizing, the whole experience, that, they feel like this is another way that they can try and make it right.
Because being part Samoan, it's sort of like we like to keep things behind closed doors. And if there's an issue, we try and deal with it as a family.
If something happened to me that I felt would create conflict within a group, I'd be very reluctant to say something, or if it was going to make anyone feel uncomfortable or like have to choose between people.
What did actually happen? Was it even really a big deal? And you kind of nearly tone it down for yourself to make you feel like it's okay, like you will live another day.
Where they felt like they didn't want to have sex, and then it just happened, and then they were like, oh, like, maybe that's how it works.
And so it's just easier to be like, yeah, I could do better. I could do better next time. We'll convince ourselves it's always our fault.
That narrative of you should feel grateful that you have this opportunity as a young man to engage in sex or some sort of sexual activity with someone, that conflict, I think, would really, it would belittle your feelings of trauma and of shame and embarrassment.
A lot of that stuff is sitting there. It's there for sure, but it's just not expressed.
When people are silenced, then other people don't hear these stories, and for people to speak up, often they need to hear about the stories of others.
When you're having to recall or relive events and bad events in your life, you actually go into a mode of being back there.
There's a normal trauma response that most people have after being sexually assaulted, where they're in shock and they don't know what to do and they're disorientated. And usually it can take a wee while for them to make a decision to tell or a decision to report, if they do decide to report.
If it was kind of in a dating scenario, people are often confused to start with and go, well, did I? Because he'll say, well, you wanted it, and so you go, well, did I give those messages out? Was it me? Was that okay? Was that so?
It's a thing that you want to keep to yourself, because if you let it out, it just becomes massive, and it already feels so massive inside of yourself anyway. And you're afraid it's just gonna ruin everything.
I've spoken with women where they've said the first time they've tried to tell their rape story, they're tentative about telling it. They're trying to work out whether they even want to put the label rape on what happened to them.
They wanted to be able to assert that, like, they're not the type of person that this happens to, that they can keep themselves safe. And in order to do that, they had to then make me into the type of person that this happens to.
people don't actually realise the personal cost for women who speak up in this area, because it's not something that you do lightly.
People need to understand the severity of the psychological consequence and what that really means, I think.
It's not just physical, like someone sexually abused you, they touched your body. It's about the spirit that gets affected in there.
It's spiritual, it's emotional, it's psychological, it really is kind of soul destroying.
It's like that game Whack-A-Mole, you know, you pop up and, you know, something is about to whack you down, you know, and you try to pop up again and it's like, you know, there's only so many times you can, you know, get hit by that mallet, and then you're like, oh my gosh, this is just insanity. I'm just getting chopped down by the system, by people over and over again.
They still have to make sense of what's happened to them, deal with any potential trauma, work with any fallout in their friend circle or their community, and trying to do that in a social world that is hostile to victims.
For people with disabilities to report, they have to understand that what happened to them was a crime, which unfortunately is not always the case because of a lack of appropriate sexual education, teaching for people with disabilities, and then they have to have the capacity to actually physically report this. Can they pick up the phone and call someone? Do they rely on their carer, who could be the perpetrator, to communicate for them? Is the person they're ringing going to know how to respond? You know, are they going to be able to approach the service in their wheelchair or not? And then are they going to be believed?
I think victim blame works to silence people, right? So people don't come forward because they fear that they're going to be blamed, or they've internalized that blameworthiness themselves.
Maybe that there are people within your family that are trying to silence you. It may be that people within the community will come to your family to say, like, don't go to the police, don't take any court action, imagine the shame, imagine the whatever. So there's all that kind of silencing.
You know, there's only about 10% that report. For Pacifica, it's less than half of that. It's probably 3 or 4%. So they're not going to come forward, and there's a whole lot of issues with that. And a lot of that is, you know, the shame and the blame, and also because we're a collective society, it's about actually the rest of the family and not wanting to bring any kind of shame or blame on the whole family or, you know, the community.
If you're sitting there knowing that your whole community is going to be blamed and shamed for this incident, that is a huge barrier for you to speak up, because it's not going to make you feel better to see your community being attacked publicly for what happened to you.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
You have a cultural gap of, you know, being migrants here within another culture, but also you're constantly told to assimilate and how easy it is to just do these things, you know, but sometimes it's not.
If you're going in for counselling and you have to spend half the session kind of explaining your culture or the cultural dynamics that you're facing, then you can't get the help that you need.
You have to understand why we have reservations around how to access support, how to go to the police, or how to access these agencies, because is that going to do more harm to us as our community, as individuals?
If you think about being, say, a 13-year-old girl and someone sexually abused you, to tell means that then you're seen as a sexual being in your family. So you may not want your father to ever know that you're a sexual being at 12. You know, things like that distort relationships.
If I'm a child, why would I tell my parents if I know they're going to be devastated to hear this? You won't. You protect them. Any child will protect their parents, so they might not disclose until those parents have passed away.
There can be a fear that, say if it happened at a party, that if you tell, you'll never be allowed out of the house again and never allowed to go to another party. And, you know, teenagers, their healing depends on them being able to still be in the world and go out there and test the limits of their safety.
There's a lot of bullying goes on. So somebody at school, you know, within a school, the school finds out, and then from both male and female will bully the person that was assaulted.
We see so many girls who end up leaving school because the whole school community turns on her, not holding him to account.
I think in general society has this view of a perfect victim as a white woman assaulted by a stranger who kind of held her down against her will, who said no lots of times, and yet still this happened to them. And then they report to police straight away and are very clear and concise about what happened to them. But in reality, that is just not what we see.
The men that do experience harm have significant issues because of the narrative driving something where men are going to be told, well, that's just not something that can happen to men.
For men, there's myths around their physical size. So if you really didn't want that, you could have fought him off.
It's not that they're embarrassed about saying what happened, it's the stupidity that comes back.
People reading that as like, well, if you were assaulted by a man, then you're gay, and it's actually, that's nothing to do with their sexuality.
You know, you were lucky. You know, if you were sexually abused by a woman as a boy or a teenager, then, you know, that was considered to be, you know, good luck. You know, you were very fortunate.
People taking advantage of their power and then people celebrating that. And that can be really difficult for that young person who's like, okay, well, I feel like I was taken advantage of, but all of a sudden all these people are telling me like that's a really cool thing that has happened.
You know, also the stereotypes around, you know, you just don't talk about things like feelings and about, so if you felt confused or harmed or shamed.
Our men especially are told to harden up, shut up, you know, grow up.
There are so many contradictory expectations about how victims are supposed to behave in order to be seen as legitimate victims who are worthy of help and support. So on the one hand, there are expectations that somebody who's truly been victimized should be broken, should be meek, they're passive, they're very like worn down by what's happened, or they're just kind of a pathetic person. And the other side of it is we're in this neoliberal capitalist context that really values people picking themselves up by their bootstraps, making the best of all of the situations that life might throw at them. We're supposed to like make gold of suffering. We're supposed to grow in the face of adversity. We're supposed to be kind of like entrepreneurs of ourselves.
Society is like tells people, well, if you've experienced sexual violence, then go to the police immediately. And because of all the things that we've just been talking about, like, how unlikely is it that some people are going to go to the police?
A lot of our survivors, the reason they come forward is because they know that the alleged perpetrator is probably harming others.
Obviously, the underreporting of sexual assault shows that people aren't actually comfortable to speak up.
But they kind of get thrusted into this system where things are done very like structurally, and yeah, it can really like break up how you're meant to heal.
Oh yeah, like you just tell the cops and they fix it.
That's one of your boys. Oh.
We don't know how to intervene when something's going on in our communities. We're told to not touch it, and the police will come and do it. And so sometimes that results in further harm being caused.
Sometimes it's not the best place to go, so people won't go there. They're like, nah, my wairoa and my nako and all that is more important to take care of than it is to get the police to track it and then go through all the interrogation, which actually is just another violation anyway.
The biggest organisation that I've seen a change in has been the New Zealand Police. Absolutely, I've seen that. Where coppers back in the day would turn a blind eye.
If you don't feel comfortable doing it, then don't do it, but also you have to know it's going to be a lot of work.
They would go to the police station ordinarily or make a call, and the police have a specialist group that would speak with them. In most cases, they would be talked to by the police and encouraged to make a statement about what they say happened, and they would be encouraged to do that, and it would be video recorded. purpose of that is, if it goes to a trial at a later date, that video record of what they said would be used as part of their evidence. So the man and woman who makes the complaint may then be medically examined, looking for DNA or other contributors from the alleged offender. They would interview people who might come to that. They would go to the scene, hopefully find out what was happening, look at historical records if it was an historical case. Once they had what they thought was a sufficient information to support the case, they would then want to talk to the alleged offender. If they thought the prosecution was still warranted, they could then lay charges after that, arrest the person, lay charges and proceed along the criminal justice process.
What the prosecutor has to be satisfied of is that there's credible, reliable evidence that an identifiable person committed the offence and that there's a reasonable prospect of conviction. So a properly directed jury would be able to find guilt beyond reasonable doubt. People think there's that one thing that they can do. They can go to police, they report it, and then it goes to trial. And inevitably a lot of people are then disappointed when it doesn't go to trial, and quite understandably so.
There's not very many, successes in women fighting against men about their assaults.
I guess when you're young, you're quite naive and thinking like, oh, the justice system is great, like it locks up criminals, like we're all safe because of it.
Our integrity gets discussed and our actual assault gets discussed, and we have to relive these moments.
In sexual cases where you have often specific vulnerabilities just by the fact that you've been violated in the way that you have, to then be told it's not your case, it's the state's case, and this is not your lawyer, it's the prosecutor, and the prosecutor is an officer of the court, that can be really difficult.
In the adversarial system, what happens is that the victim effectively becomes a witness for the Crown. So the case that actually is between the Crown and the defence ends up being this kind of battle. In many ways, it's not does the truth prevail, but it's who fights more effectively than the other to win the contest.
In our adversarial system, you're never going to get people understanding what really happened because it's not even about truth.
Adversarial law is really rooted in, patriarchal power.
So that whole system, I think, seriously lets victims down. It does rapists a favour, and in that sense, the justice system colludes with men who rape.
And that's the essential part that the Crown has to prove. The activity took place. It was without her consent and without him reasonably believing she was consenting. So the jury had to decide, well, okay, was the person did they really hold that belief that she was consenting? And was it reasonable in the circumstances to have that belief?
Almost universally, what people say, is that they had a reasonable belief, right? So that's problematic for us because that's where rape myth comes in.
Sometimes people are worried about how the system might treat them, and I think they still should be. The system isn't that kind. However, there have been a lot of reforms made to try and make the system better and the process better.
Often I apologise to my clients and I say, I'm really sorry, our justice model is not very contemporary. It's not contemporary. And not only that, it's not challenging the people that should be being challenged.
And I know, I put it out there, my hand goes up, that it is all about a fair trial. Get that, absolutely. Everybody's rights, but there's not a lot of victim rights going on in there.
The person who is the alleged offender has a series of rights, and from one of them, they don't have to say anything.
So we've got an awful lot of protections, which mean that juries can't know a lot of background information about the defendant. Conversely, we allow in court information about the alleged victim to be presented, questions asked or insinuated about her character or about her sexual reputation, etc. And even though we've actually brought in legal restrictions to try and limit that and to limit evidence about her sexual history, etc. being presented, there's still lawyers can actually find ways to ask a question even if they know the judge is going to overrule it. They've then planted a doubt in the jury's mind.
Even if you get a jury of your peers, because victim blaming is so much part of our culture, those peers also have those biases.
You want people who are essentially plucked from the street at random to adjudicate on a case that involves really complex issues and dynamics.
And there has been many discussions around whether or not jurors should be advised by the judge about what is actual normal behaviour for a sexual violence survivor, to try and dispel some of those rape myths that, you know, the defence can use to win a case.
She unbuttoned her blouse and showed a bit of cleavage.
You say after the fact. You didn't call the police that night.
Enough to invent things that aren't true, enough to make up these stories?
I'll be honest, the process itself, it is still very difficult. Having to, like I said earlier, relive, having to tell 12 strangers how he raped, how he offended. They still struggle with that.
You're going to actually have all of these things happen to you, which are going to be hurtful, harmful, triggering and distressing, all the things that you were not expecting.
And that's an inherent tension in the adversarial system between making it a bit easier for the complainant and finding out what happened, as opposed to the defence lawyer doing his or her job and putting the case, and sometimes bluntly, but fairly, to the complainant.
Only 13% of reported cases resulted in a conviction. And then it was mostly because the accused felt pressured to plead guilty to try and get a reduction in sentence.
Research shows that psychological outcomes out the end of it, yes, if there's a not guilty verdict, you are worse off than if you never went to police.
When we got together people from across the sector, the message that really came through really strongly was that there needed to be some kind of alternative to the defended trial model, that what was affecting people's decision-making, everyone's decision-making, from reporting all the way through to juries' verdicts and judges' verdicts, was the high penalty for sexual assault. Sexual violation by rape, 20 years maximum penalty imprisonment. And the way that the guideline works means that we would be looking at a starting point of around 7-8 years. When a jury or when a defendant or when anyone involved hears that 20-year maximum penalty, that really does impact on the kinds of decisions you make. Am I going to take responsibility, or am I going to take my chance and fight? Well, you know, as defence counsel, what are you going to advise your client?
And that's certainly a disincentive, because they fear that if they plead guilty, they're still going to spend a number of years in prison.
Often that admission of guilt only comes because they're scared they're going to lose the trial, because their lawyer will say to them, hey, we've got to look, there's a lot of evidence stacking up here. I think it might be better for you to plead guilty to some of the charges. Not the real serious ones, just some of them. And then we can try and get you a really low sentence. Again, all of this is not about the survivor. This is not about taking responsibility. This is not about addressing the harm that's been caused.
We say, well, you went through that process, the court found that you were guilty, and the court found that yes, that did happen to you. This person's going to jail. They'll be there for 3 years. You go back to your life.
I think there's a lot more we could do, but unfortunately, our criminal justice system has a solution: prison.
I feel like a lot of victims' families would be like, just chuck them in jail. This is what they did to my daughter, or this is what they did to my son. And that's sort of a way for them to mourn through it too.
Seeing these people as pariahs and wanting them locked up and throw away the key so that the rest of us good men can just get on with life and, you know, do all the right things. I think that's up for question.
Obviously there's more Māori and Pacifica in prisons where like this system isn't the best for everyone.
And maybe that's to hide the inherent injustice in our system.
Again, I think that's something that the criminal justice system has had a monopoly over, right? Defining what accountability means. And so accountability, according to that system, has been punitive. It has been punishment. It's been incarceration. But accountability, I think, is subjective.
It's a retributive system, so one that
relies on this, I think, very outdated understanding of how you can incentivize people to do things differently. That if you create really strong incentives for someone to not do something and you make an example out of them, that you'll somehow create a condition in which they're less likely to do that thing again, or others who observe you punishing them will heed that lesson. Well, the whole sort of system of prisons is not tikanga at all. Prior to colonisation, prisons weren't a structure within Te Ao Māori. It was completely sort of foreign. The first prison built in Aotearoa was built to house Māori who were protesting against forms of extraction and colonisation and power and coercion that they experienced at the hands of Pākehā.
The foundation of their system, where it originates from, isn't from a place of aroha, pure aroha and manaakitanga-like care, and so you kind of lose those human aspects. You have to abide by these rules, and so the moment that you don't, then that affects how much desire to keep giving you this love, unconditional love. It kind of restricts that.
You know, the fact that our prisons are disproportionately affecting Māori, that's not a coincidence, and that's not just an accident, that's exactly the point.
The prison is often kind of discussed by people like Angela Davis, Tracy McIntosh, as the warehousing of surplus humanity, right? So social problems that the state doesn't want to deal with just kind of get warehoused.
Nā o ngā whenua katoa o te uru o te ao, kei a tātou tētahi o ngā tatauranga teitei, mo te tini ka mauheretia e tātou.
The reason why we have this enormous prison population and why the people who are in our prisons are much more likely to have experienced trauma, to come from socioeconomic backgrounds where they experience deprivation and poverty and trauma and harm, to have mental health or drug addiction issues, that's not by accident. That's because we have decided to invest in a system, an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, except that it's not an ambulance, it's jail, to deal with complex social issues that we helped to create. I went into Arahata prison in Tawa and sat with 22 women that were going through the drug and alcohol program, and 20 out of those 22 women had all been sexually abused as children. For a lot of those that are sitting in our prisons, especially our male prisons, when you actually look back on the history of those men, you're looking at scared little boys that were harmed horrendously.
Men who have experienced sexual abuse and harmful sexual behaviour as children, who then their lives become very chaotic, and as men they often act out their version of masculinity and their trauma in a way which means they end up as a problem for society.
So much harm is experienced inside prisons, including sexual violence. And again, that's partly because it's a dehumanising place.
I feel mixed about, because prisons don't work, in regards to addressing those harmful behaviours. And survivors say that. They're like, well, he'll just go away for 5 years and he'll come out, he'll do it again.
A lot of people say, well, they're only going in there to learn new skills. Sad reality, yes, they probably are.
Roughly 60% of those who go to prison reoffending within 2 years.
Part of the problem is that prisons are set up to pursue contradictory outcomes. Punishment, containment, and rehabilitation. They definitely contain people. They definitely punish them. In most cases, they fail to rehabilitate people.
Some certainly warrant a term of imprisonment. Some of the offenders are personality disordered and may well re-offend because they don't understand they're doing is wrong.
They have come to the realisation themselves that, I deserve to be in here because I done dumb shit. But now I understand why I did dumb shit. And I know that when I come out, I'm going to be a better person.
I think for some people who engage in harmful sexual behaviour, prison for a period of time where and if they could get the right sort of help could be and is a useful intervention, but it's not a one-size-fits-all. It can never be that.
So there's lots of conversations around just scrapping it all. So that's the idea. People would love that, but the practicality of that for Aotearoa, the cost of all the money that went into making prisons and the justice system, training people, there comes that human kind of aspect of how would this threaten my livelihood? What would it do to my security and my worldview?
Hopefully they won't do that without taking into account what that means for victims, because the best outcome we get from a shake-up is actually to take the needs of both parties into account. so that we get a better system that works for victims and for those who've caused harm.
For me, the reconceptualization of this like kind of victim and offender dichotomy, and understanding that as people who cause harm and people who are victims of harm, and also being able to understand that people who cause harm are also themselves victims.
They stop seeing the person and they just see the label which describes the behaviour.
If you only see what's being presented and you work with that, then it's really hard to keep this view and hope or belief that they are deserving.
It's not to say that there won't ever be space for processes and institutions held and guided by experts and expertise around how we prevent future harm. It's just that they wouldn't be grounded in an ethos of punishment.
We know that we can't just open the prison doors tomorrow and everything will be okay, because these problems are like deeply, deeply entrenched, and that flow of harm is one that's been carried down through generations.
So many of our survivors really want the people who've harmed them to get help. They're like, I just want him to get help, because he'll just keep doing this.
The chance to actually tell their story, be validated by others in the telling of it, and a desire to actually see the perpetrator understand what they've actually done and how that's impacted.
Sometimes when you're hurt, what you want is punitive. Sometimes when you're hurt, what you want is punishment, and to see someone else suffer, like, I know that, goddamn, I know that's true. But, you know, having that support network around you to make sure that you feel heard and supported.
And I think for a lot of us who are like really like passionate about this kind of work, it's because we do it because there was nothing for us when we needed it.
We can build an alternative where people who have been hurt, who are survivors of sexual violence, see a way for the person who hurt them to be held accountable, but also to be supported to not hurt others again that doesn't involve prison.
Different forms of broadly restorative approaches, I think, is something that's really worth exploring, because that way we might get to the people who at the moment are not having their harm addressed at all.
Yeah, Project Restore is a restorative justice provider, and the only cases it deals with are where there's been harmful sexual behaviour. Often the most appropriate method for individuals where the harm has occurred within a relationship is to take them back into a type of relational experience where it can be addressed, and where the person who's been harmed can, in a sense, reclaim their power in the dynamic of the relationship and feel empowered to confront and challenge and ask and tell.
It wasn't just sit in front of each other and go, well, you did this and you did that and I'm sorry and da-da-da-da-da. It is a process.
There are 3 practitioners on every case. One is the person who works with the person who caused the harm, and that's my function. We have a person who works with who's been harmed, and then we have the third person is the facilitator who will facilitate the conference.
I think, though, that there are some cautionary aspects there, which is that not every case is going to be suitable.
Like, what's that power differential between the two parties? Because otherwise, how do you know that you're getting genuine consent from her, just in the same way that he might not have, gotten genuine consent from her in the first place?
Because sometimes we shouldn't be sharing spaces. If you've damaged someone, it's like we shouldn't be sharing the same wairoa at the moment until we have a space where we know that everyone's mode and wairoa will be taken care of, and that takes a bit of work.
And it may be that the victim is simply not willing or not ready, and I don't think there should be any measure of pressuring victims to be involved in any kind of restorative process.
We've had occasions where a restorative process has been put forward. The survivor has said, yeah, actually, that sounds like it could work for us. Those that actually do the process, the facilitators, have turned around and said, that ain't gonna work, because he's pulling the wool.
A lot of people think, oh my gosh, you could never put an offender, a person who's caused harm, in a room with the victim safely. Well, that isn't our experience. Our experience is done with the right level of careful assessment, preparation, planning, and with their agreement, and with the right level of external supports around them, a very meaningful process can occur. So here they are in a process with the person that did that, where they are in control. and they are able to say things and ask questions and stop it and start it at any time. It's a very empowering process, therapeutic process, intervention, whatever you want to call it. It's powerful. There's a discussion at the end about what the person who's been harmed wants in terms of outcomes. So that could be reparation, could be that the person does a harmful sexual behaviour program, gets counselling, doesn't acknowledge them in the street, moves town, literally moves town. Sometimes that has to happen. These people go from a place of often intense shame or denial, absolute denial, like didn't do it, didn't cause any harm, to a real capacity for empathy.
So transformative justice is dealing with not only the immediate relationships between people, but people's relationships to themselves and understanding of themselves. And then again, those relationships to a wider community, and then the structural relations that continue to oppress people and produce harmful interpersonal relationships as well.
Transformative justice to me is something that kind of thinks about transforming not just the structures around us, but the way that people on an interpersonal level think about harm and what they do to kind of either reduce it or help people who've been through it. A lot of the work that needs to be done is kind of amongst ourselves and learning how we kind of deal with harm in our own, like household, and then like your friend circle, and then like your wider circle. Like, what do you do when people around you are doing really fucked up stuff?
There's different kind of roles within like a process. So I think it's important to have people who are supporting the person who has caused harm. And that's can be really, really difficult work, but really important to make sure that they're held accountable and that they're continuing to work on themselves. A facilitator who can facilitate that communication as well as kind of like oversee the progress of what's been happening. And then there's the people who are supporting the person who's been harmed. And that's about like care, that's about support, that's about communication, and that's about kind of constantly asking and checking in with what they need.
In old days, if something happened, then your tribe would have a korero and hui about it, and first of all you would maintain the mana of that person no matter what they did. We're like, let's just remind you you're born from greatness, but your practice today isn't practicing from that place of greatness. And in terms of accountability, we also have to acknowledge that the other person is born from greatness and great tupuna. So how do those alignments happening, or how do we repay or fix or repair that? And so it's not necessarily that the person who did the damage does that. It would have been the tribe or the people going to address that family. In this society, people want to hear from the individual who did the harm, but that person is not always present in their body. So we're asking someone who is unwell, practicing unwell practices, to now speak from a place that they can't always stay in. They're not quite conscious. So the benefit of having other people do that is that your whānau will be focusing on that person that you've done damage to while taking care of you.
What's kind of appropriate, I guess, for Pacifica people is very much like Māori marae-based justice, so which is similar to restorative justice, yeah? Because we're a collective society, it's about restoring the relationships, working from a place that's about who they are, essentially, because that helps when you're going forward, helps to bring kind of understanding, but it doesn't fit into mainstream. You come, you book one session, it's 50 minutes, see you later, come to the next week. It's just not about that, it's actually taking that time to work with what actually they need at that moment.
So in the middle of the night, you're not going to call me because I'll clock out at 5. So who will you call? You'll call those people that in the community they're used to. And so if we can build that up, then we build and empower them and give them energy to hold the whole community going forward.
Different communities and different cultures have different ways of responding to harm, and we need to acknowledge that, particularly in a country where we have so long failed to uphold and respect Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So for Māori communities, how they resolve certain kinds of harm is up to them. actually.
I think that we kind of need to move away from a one law for all, one model, one structure for everyone, and I think we need to move to what will work best and have the most positive outcomes in this situation.
For me, it feels like a successful process would be one that thinks about the kind of like nuances and can be adapted depending on what you're working with, really.
There's a lot of room for alternative avenues of restoration, so, restorative justice processes or transformative justice processes, which fit a lot better for a lot of people, but also might fit a lot better for specific communities that have no desire to take a punitive approach.
There is a lot of talk about the risk of innovating, of doing things differently, of transformational change, but not enough people think about the risk of continuing with the status quo and how much harm that's currently doing.
There is definitely an emphasis on focusing on people's individual behaviours.
We removed the fact that they were socialised in a family, that they were socialised in a school, that they were socialised in a community and in a country.
Like, to admit that is to admit like gigantic failings of social justice within our society. I believe that if through our system we're able to deal with it while they're growing up or experiencing it, then that would change the outcome.
And so many men are like not accountable for their mates and not accountable for themselves, and they really need to step up, in my opinion.
Just talking about it ain't enough. It's actually got to be done in practice.
It's going to harm the future generations. It's harming me, it's harming your little sister, it's harming your mother. You need to like figure it out.
Actually putting yourself in another person's position and not just saying it's not my problem because I don't have to deal with this.
Harmful behaviour doesn't just develop within an individual and like in a single moment, That's often something, particularly with sexual violence, that is like learnt and that is like ingrained.
For some people it's just good they could. Simple as that. But for others it's about, well, it happened to me. So the question I will put back to that is, well, it happened to me as well, but do you see me going around raping everybody? No. What I did was I broke that cycle.
None of this is going to be a quick fix. This is about long-term cultural change.
It's really important to have these conversations around privilege and around entitlement and around equity as early as possible.
Seeing what the powers that they have, seeing how they can actually give up and relinquish the powers that they have to people who actually are voiceless.
Combating homophobia, biphobia and transphobia needs to be part of sexual violence work.
We really need to hear the lived experiences of people from every walk of life.
I think there's sometimes this desire to find like the one silver bullet,
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking, end patriarchy, establish connection. Woo, solved. If only it was that easy.
It's patriarchy that's the problem. And we all live under that system. So, while men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of violence, I think it's probably, would make sense to look at why.
It's permeated and seeped its way right through our culture. It's going to take more than policies, more than law changes to try and eradicate it.
Institutions like schools and families, having a commitment across the curriculum to modelling good consent and respecting each other's boundaries.
But actually lots of it is, how do you have a healthy relationship? What are like the positive, because if you're telling people what not to do all the time, then inevitably you're not telling them what they should be doing.
It is how we raise our boys. We raise our boys to be good men.
What has my son done? What has my husband done? What has my work colleague done? What has my friend done? Go, be uncomfortable with it. Don't just, it must have been her. step into that uncomfortable place.
Oh, well, actually, I behaved in that way that now people are saying is not appropriate or is criminal. Or, oh, I let that happen to me, or that did happen to me, and I didn't realise, I didn't characterise it in that way. And all of those are uncomfortable dialogues to have with ourselves. You know, all of that is uncomfortable.
The sexual violence movement is working to eliminate sexual violence, and I don't think that you have to be aspirational, I am aspirational.
We're not ruined forevermore if we've been hurt, but at the same time, acknowledging that it can take time to heal.
You know, the sooner that you get help, and we've seen that with research, that the sooner you get help, the better your recovery.
Anyone who's kind of struggling with something that's happened to them, really great to reach out. Good to reach out to a specialist service so that you know that the responses to you aren't going to be informed by rape myth. They're going to be there to support you.
Don't be afraid if you're unsure. Ask. There are specialist agencies, there's the police, there's your school teachers, there's amazing people out there that, you know, but always remember that you are in control.
I'm a professor fighting patriarchy. Right.
Yeah, I think they're afraid.
Turn around and tell them. Or turn around and tell her. Do that again, I'll take you out.
Was that a good answer? We hold humanity, like we give birth, we hold life.
Oh my God, you know, I want to do my PhD on that.
I can't remember what I was talking about now. I just got real excited about being trans.
Okay, boomer.
Adversarial model, you know, he said, she said.
Saying that the oppression against, Siri.
Women were supposed to be in the kitchen making babies. I suppose in the kitchen and making babies.
You know, Jimmy down the hall in the dorm.
I just saw a mouse. It's very cute.
About how people find a million excuses for a thing to not be racism.
Yeah, that's just my little bitch about that. An overblown sense of entitlement is a massive part.
Rampant forms of capitalism. Does that answer the question?
If they grab you like this, then you gotta go do this move and do that move, right? And you're just thinking, like, where are all the men?
Consuming 30 cans of RTDs.
I made the mistake of reading the Facebook comments.
We keep taking the knockbacks, but we keep knocking on the door.
Am I hopeful for the future? I am really hopeful for the future.
Just have safe consensual sex, you know? Like, psh.